Several of you were here about a year ago when we had a Wednesday night series about other faith traditions. And on one of those Wednesday nights, we hosted Rabbi Peter Berg, who is rabbi of the temple, just a couple of miles south of us on Peachtree. He was great fun. We sat on stools and I asked him questions. He bantered back and forth, a lot of fun. My first question was, what's the difference between a temple and a synagogue? Well, in the course of his answer, he kind of started poking fun a little at their name. He said that they are called the temple, and he was a little bit concerned that it could sound kind of haughty, like they're the only ones in town, we are the temple. But he said when we were birthed in 1867, we were the temple. That's why the name. It was the only one in town. It was the temple. And still in Atlanta, it holds forth as kind of the center of Jewish life in Atlanta, the center of service and worship in that congregation just south of here. But the temple in Jerusalem had a whole different character than the temple in Atlanta. It had much more central prominence to first century Judaism. The temple on Peachtree is the worship and service center of Atlanta's Jewish community, but the temple in Jerusalem was at the center of everything. It was at the center of the region's religious, civic, cultural, and economic life. It's hard to think of it in those terms today, but the temple was the major industry of Jerusalem. And so the energy around the temple was just relentless. People always there, gathered at the temple, scurrying pilgrims and galumping livestock and moving families and unruly doves and eager pilgrims and uncontrollable goats on their way to their final offering, singing, "I surrender all." This huge, beautiful building teeming with activity. And around the temple were 13 trumpet-shaped receptacles where the faithful would come and drop in their offering. Now, they all made tithes. They all gave 1/10 of their income to the temple. So before I continue the story, let me drop back and talk a moment about the tithe. Now, those of you who have a family budget, try to stay to a family budget, know that you start with the most important stuff and then you move down. You put in the house payment and then the car payment, and then you get to utilities and credit cards and insurance and finally haircuts and Netflix, and you kind of move that way. When the Hebrews sat down to make budget, they started with the tithe. The first 10% goes to the temple. Devotion to God is the primary thing in our life. The first 10% goes to the temple, then we make the house payment, and then the lease payment on the donkey. It moves from there. Tithe was automatic. But around the temple, there were these 13 horn-shaped offering plates where people would come and make additional offerings. Offerings were sometimes called alms. These were the monies that were given to the poor to provide for those on the margins, to care for the orphans and the widows. And people would come by and they're moving and scurrying and put money in a little extra. Some people would make offering so that the poor people could be helped. And they did this for any number of reasons, but the most noble, of course, is just out of sheer gratitude. Because it's hard to be grateful and stingy at the same time. When you stop and count the number of blessings in your life, you are usually moved to generosity. And some people just give because they are so grateful they can't do otherwise. They have the capacity to produce. They recognize that other people don't have their privilege, they don't have their capacity, and they give. They give out of delight. They give out of a celebration that they can. You know these people. I played golf a few months ago when it was 95 degrees, and the guy I was playing with stopped the woman who had the hospitality cart, and he got a Powerade to replenish. Well, it was $2 or $3, I guess, for a Powerade. It was going to go on his bill at the country club, but then I saw him quietly. He didn't make any fuss of this at all. He didn't even know I saw it. He handed her a $20 bill as a tip. A $20 tip on a $2 Powerade. Who does that? Some people. Some people who are so generous, they just feel so much blessing. They feel so much capacity. It is a celebration of their ability to produce. They have this noble interest in giving just because they feel grateful. But there are other people who give for reasons that are not quite as noble. In the story just prior to our story today, Jesus was teaching the disciples, and he said this to them: "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance, they say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. And many rich people, put in large sums. There's some people willing to give, just as long as people know how much they give, long as they get some credit for it. Little spotlight turned my way. I know of a church in suburban South Carolina. It's a suburb of a large city in South Carolina. In the 1980s and into the 90s, the church was just really growing because this particular South Carolina city was growing. It pushed into the suburbs. As more and more people were moving into the suburbs, First Baptist Church got a boom. They were growing too. They built a new sanctuary. And they had gone to 2 Sunday schools because their Sunday school space wasn't adequate. And there was discussion about tearing down the old sanctuary to make room to build new Sunday school space. Well, the old sanctuary was in disrepair. It was a beautiful building, a throwback. You've seen these probably, a kind of rounded sanctuary with wooden floors and wooden pews. It creaked and smelled like your great-grandmother's house, but it was charming. Well, discussions about tearing it down, new Sunday school space, and the like. Well, as you can imagine, it was emotional for a lot of people. And then came the designated check. A man, fourth generation in the church, wrote a check for $300,000 and designated it for the renovation of the old sanctuary building and for the naming of it in memory of his mother, which made him the hero of all the people who wanted it kept. Jesus said that everybody who came by and put in offerings into the horn-shaped coffers were not motivated by pure gratitude or by an interest in helping others. Some, he said, walk around in long robes and like to be treated like a somebody. Some like to stop and pour their coins in and make a spectacle of how much they're giving away to help the orphans and the widows. Can you picture Jesus just propped up and watching? He's such an observer of human nature, watching all the hubbub, the spectacle. observing all the different ways people approach the offering coffers, how they give. And then right after the guys with the long robes and the long prayers, a poor widow shuffles up to the trumpet-shaped offering and reaches in. By the way, poor widow is probably redundant. In almost every biblical occurrence, a widow is placed alongside the poor, the landless immigrant. In the social structure of ancient Israel, a widow is in no man's land. That was a pun. Were you paying attention? She has minimal inheritance rights. It's a patriarchal culture. The death of her husband usually meant social, economic, and cultural death for her as well. And the poor widow shuffles up to the place of offering and drops in 2 small copper coins worth a penny. Our modern biblical translations translate the denomination. They call it 2 pennies, but the King James Version calls it what it was called back then, mites. And like the mite, like a penny, the mite was the smallest unit of money at the time. Ryan Wilson owns a mite. Can you see how small that is? He bought it in an antique shop in Jerusalem, and he let me borrow it for this sermon. It's not much, as you can tell. By the way, Ryan paid $23 for something that was a penny. It tells you how savvy those of us in ministry are with our finances. She dropped in 2 of those, the smallest unit of money there was. And why? You remember me saying that the offerings went to help the orphans and the widows. She is one. Why would she give her last 2 coins to help poor people? She is poor people. Some people have criticized her, saying, okay, if you're going to make an offering, fine, put in 1 mite, but keep 1. I mean, it would have been an outrageous generosity if she'd put half of her money in and kept the other half. Why not keep 1? Besides, it can't make that much of a difference. Jesus has just been watching all these people with the long prayers and the long robes, and they're pouring money in. They look like the young guys at Publix with the shoebox full at the Coinstar machine, just pouring it in. These showy guys who are dumping all their loud change, those are the guys who can make a difference. She comes by and puts in 2 pennies. Well, she's not putting it in thinking she's about to build the new wing at the children's hospital. And she isn't putting it in to show off. And she isn't putting it in to help poor people because she is poor people. And she's not putting it in because she's committed to all of the causes of the temple's good work. Remember, the passage before this one highlights some of the abuse. Some of the people with the best seats, some of the people being greeted with respect are the same people who are taking financial advantage of the widows. They devour widows' houses for the sake of appearance. They say long prayers. She gives because the love of God is in her, and generosity is the only response to grace. Somehow she is so moved by the grace of God that she is compelled to give. Generosity is the only response to grace. And Jesus is propped up watching. And he calls his disciples over and says to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the treasury. For they've contributed out of their abundance, and she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Jesus doesn't comment on whether or not he thinks she should have kept one back to buy groceries. He doesn't say, like he says in some other instances, she has done the better thing. He simply says that she has given everything and that it counts for more than the tips of the affluent. And clearly, her giving is intended to be a model for us, but I struggle to know how. It's just too simple for me to take the pulpit and say, "Go ye therefore and give all of your money away," because we have house payments and college loans, and both of the children need braces. And most of us are living paycheck to paycheck, wondering if there'll be money left at the end of the month or month left at the end of the money. So how do we take this story seriously? First, as I mentioned last week, it should challenge the centrality of our devotion. Are we giving what we should? Are we giving a regular percentage of our income to the ministry of the church? As you've heard already, there are many in this church who tithe already. They are giving 10% of their income to the church. If you're not, are you moving in that direction? Some regular percentage. How central is the life of faith if you're not at home talking about starting with 2%, maybe next year 3%? The widow's extravagance does challenge the extent to which we are all in. And let's be honest, she irritates us just a little bit. It's easy for us to say, "I'll do my part when I'm more secure." I mean, some of these Buckhead folks have stockbrokers and long driveways. They can carry it for a while, and then when I'm a little better off, I'll contribute then. And then she gave her last 2 pennies. And it irritates us because it challenges something we know we ought to be. There's something about the excess of this spontaneous act of gratitude that inspires us and challenges us and irritates us. And we can dismiss the story, but we can't dismiss the story. Not only because it's here, but because it keeps staying with us. It keeps pressing us. It keeps irritating us in the best possible way. And so her generosity leads us to ask, how is it that I have a bank draft every month for my monthly massage and Netflix and to reload my Starbucks card, and I don't have a regular bank draft to support my church? See, she irritates us. Her story causes us to ask, if the widow gave everything because of her gratitude to God, what does my amount of giving say about me? She makes us so uncomfortable. When we hear her 2 coins hit the plate, it challenges our priorities, and it intends to. So how are we going to respond to this poor widow's challenge of who we are.